He is the state. So, in fact, the kingdom started from brute force, from war. It does not last without a lasting practice of the dominated to reproduce their own domination. In fact, the king is made a king from the conquerors and from the conquest too. And now I give you another provocative example, and it is the end. Slavery in Roma. A slave is taken by force, maybe, or is sold by his community. But after he is linked to you personally, you are his master. It seems to me that the Latins, the Romans, they were creating a quasi-kinship relationship with the slaves. The slave was called puer servus, and the son of a free man was called puer filius. At the age of 16, a puer filius was becoming a vir. He was presented to the gods of a city, on the forum, and so on. And for a slave, when the master was dying, very often he was, how do you say, affranchir?
Emancipated.
Emancipated. And the ceremony of emancipation for a slave was a copy, reduced copy of the emancipation of a young free boy, a free man. And it seems to me that violence is not enough in order to understand the lasting power of domination. And the creation of fictive kinship was absolutely necessary in order to extract as much as possible from a slave. And I have found a very interesting quotation from pseudo-Aristotle. And he says, there are three things to consider in the case of a slave: work, chastisement, and food. It is right and beneficial to set before them freedom as the price of their toil. For slaves will willingly accept fatigue when there is a reward in sight and their time of servitude limited. And the children that we permit them to have must be token of loyalty to us. So you get to the effect that at the end, for a good slave, he can identify his own interests with those of his master. Because in front of him, freedom is there for him, but surely for his children, and so on and so on. And so, we know, in fact, that in antiquity, the idea of abolishing slavery, well, was not a leading idea. And the change, the deep change from a so-called slave society to another kind of society, oppressive one, did not come from riots or revolution from the slaves. And I think it is for deep structural reasons. It is because politics was acting as economy, that there was no way for the slaves to have a political consciousness of themselves and to fight political battles in order to abolish the structure of domination. It is because politics was something for free peoples and was defining the status of a free man. There was no such thing, no structural possibilities for slaves to take a political consciousness of themselves, to fight political battles, and to fight political battles is to take the power and to reconstruct society. So each time you see dominant ideas or dominated ideas, transformation of a structure, it seems there is somewhere something like an hierarchy of, not levels, I should say, but of function in the social practice. And it's around what is operating as relationship of production that you find the core to understand the domination of ideas or the domination of institutions and the motion which shift from one locus to another one form to another one. Now, I shall conclude. better to have the discussion than just to add more material.
I'd like to comment, if I hope briefly.
I'll try to do that. Unfortunately, I didn't realise that Maurice Godelier was going to present his papers so fully, so I've a bit summarised again. One thing I'd like to say is it seems to me that the paper falls into two parts. One is a restatement of views expressed on several earlier occasions, though I may say never with such clarity and cogency. And the other half deals with considerations which, to me at least, are new. The first part stresses a distinction between surface phenomena and an explanatory level, which corresponds to a distinction between idiom and function. What he characterizes as empiricism is the identification of function from merely the nature of a dominant idiom. I'm not quite sure actually he was guilty of this, but it's obviously wrong. It follows, therefore, that the fact that politics or religion or kinship dominates culturally or organizes the economic process does not mean that religion or kinship as we think of them are the prime mover, since in a society like the Australian Aborigines, what is superficially like what we call kinship may actually function in part as the relation of productions, i.e. the infrastructure, in a totally dissimilar way from the functions of kinship in our society. One must not be a reductionist, says Godelier, and deny the idiomatic primacy of kinship for the actors, but one must also not just stop on the surface. This is summary of Maurice's argument. However, moving away from the surface is all very well, and I think, indeed, it's obviously an essential step. But you can't just move away from the surface, and the return journey is essential. Indeed, it's the point of the whole thing, since explaining the surface is what we're dealing with. And for example, if we look at Kahn's paper or Humphreys' paper, we can see that the last part of their paper is indeed this return to explaining something on the surface. And this also Godelier does, and I want to have a look what was the point of plunging below the surface for him. He says that we may be able to, as a result of this, ultimately predict A, when a particular idiom will dominate, that is, act as the infrastructure, and B, which idiom will dominate. The first of these questions, Godelier tells us, will only be answered somewhere further along the long journey which this poor Chinese man set out on. Although he does give us a few hints, which I must say I don't find entirely satisfactory for a reason which may come up later. But the most important aspect of his return to the surface is to answer the second question, which idiom will dominate? He tells us that it is the idiom which organizes the infrastructure. Now I find that very illuminating, but I'm not entirely sure it gets out of the tautology which he talked about. The point is that I'm not entirely sure that it's always so obvious what dominates. And also, I'm not quite sure whether he will ever call something a dominating idiom if it didn't organize the relations of production. In other words, it seems to me that one is back with the same tautology, be this as it may. For this part of the paper, therefore, I find Godelier's method totally admirable and a great step forward, but I'm not so sure whether the fruits have been quite that substantial for our prime purpose here, that is, understanding change. Right, now the next part of Godelier's article is new to me and considers the place of the conceptual in his schema, and he's primarily concerned to corner ideology. First of all, he says, ideology cannot equal ideas. Ideas are everywhere, though not everything. Secondly, ideological statements cannot be distinguished empirically from non-ideological statements because the two are a whole. If I understand him rightly, even ideas concerned with making nature known, such as plant classification, because they are linked with ideas about the naturalness of relations of production, cannot be separated from ideology. To paraphrase the earlier point, ideology too is everywhere in the ideational, but the ideational is not just ideology. So, in a very similar way to the earlier argument, the distinction, according to Godelier, must be made between different functions of ideation, summarized on page 38, and divided between ideological functions of ideation and non-ideological functions. This, this distinction is on page 40. In this way, ideology can be distinguished from non-ideology by reference to function. And as an added bonus, we can understand how ideology can be both false and appear most of the time as true, because it is organically linked with non-ideological functions of ideas. And Godelier gives several ethnographic examples of this. Again, here the argument is to my mind of exceptional clarity. And if you'll excuse me, I'd like to compare it with the one which I set out in the paper which you kindly circulated, since at first sight there seems to be a certain amount of similarity, in the sense that I too was concerned with distinguishing the ideological from the non-ideological for reasons which I guess are similar to those of Godelier, to understand how one can break out of an ideology. The difference, however, between him and me is also clear in that I attempt an empirical, on the surface distinction between ideological and non-ideological statements, linking them with differences in the types of communication. To do this is both very difficult in that some phenomena does not fall easily into either category, and I think Godelier points that out by implication, and rather dangerous since the prediction which follows, that ritual communication and ideology will have a greater place, the greater the degree of instituted inequality, may be faulted by contradictory examples. The Eskimo, for example, have been mentioned by a colleague as a possible counter case. I'm therefore open to correction on this and indeed many other points. My problem, however, is that I'm not sure that Godelier's argument is so open to correction. Having said that all there is to ideas between the ideological and the non-ideological, having said that all there is to ideas is not only ideology, and having functionally distinguished between the ideological and the non-ideological, I'm not absolutely sure what we do next. There is no comeback perhaps there is no comeback on the surface, and we are just stating that in fact there are these two aspects. Or perhaps there is a comeback, if I read Godelier right, but then this is where most of my problems come. What is explained, that is, the surface which we return to from his plunge by the analysis, is the impenetrability of ideology, why there is no source from within thought for criticism, since ideas are empirically for him both ideological and scientific. To deny ideology is like denying that the seasons follow each other, or denying that the Nile is actually flooded. The constraining force of ideology for the individual, therefore, in his argument, comes from the fact that it is continually confirmed by experience. Indeed, the consideration of the possibility that there might be concepts which can serve to criticize ideology is dismissed by implication as idealism by Godelier. In contrast, for Godelier, as for all Marxists, indeed including myself, I presume the ultimate source of change is to be found in the internal dynamics of modes of production. From time to time, this process sweeps aside a system of exploitation and ideology and brings about either a change of ideology or the end to ideology and exploitation. Although I agree with most of this, my problem is that for this change to happen, it has to involve also revolutionary ideas. But where can they come from if ideology is so impenetrable and so much a whole with non-ideological ideation? To say that, of course, is not to deny, or indeed affirm, for that matter, a primacy to infrastructures. Just to point out that the theory of thought as conservative, outlined so well by Godelier, and much of which I would retain, must be put together with a theory accounting for revolutionary thought, which I would like to stress does not only occur at occasional moments in history. With Professor Thompson next to me, I think it's hardly worth pointing out that the history of the British working class bears witness to the fact that at no time were all the people fooled all the time. Similarly, one of the points in Joel Kahn's paper is that he shows that there must be also concepts of class present in Indonesia, and which are activated at certain times and come to the fore. In other words, I would argue that some ideas must, on the surface, have no, or perhaps a different ideological nature to those that dominate. That unless we believe that change can only be external, there must be different sources for ideas, some more, some less ideological, and we must make some attempt at distinguishing these. Right. I think just one final point is I'm a bit worried about this business about slaves and using the word for children. I mean, first of all, I know a particular case where this is so, and it doesn't seem to me that it implies that people consider their slaves as children. I'd just like to point one little worry that I have. I think those of us who know French colonies know that the French always address the colonized by the tu form. It doesn't seem to me that it's to be all that easy to jump to the conclusion that they consider them as their children.
That is just wrong, I think. I mean, what you said. To be explained, maybe I can answer to.
If you make it very brief, I'd
Yes.
rather give other people a chance to
Yeah.
say something
So
and then
just
come back to you.
so I shall be brief and brutal. I mean, what he said about me, the last part of his speech, is totally wrong. Totally wrong. It's a very good example of misunderstanding of what I have said. And what I mean is, surely I am not going to introduce contradiction from the outside. It is why I have started. You excuse me, but if you read my paper, I have really answered his own question. If you have not read, you cannot even know if it is in my paper. But I have spent a lot of time to explain that consent becomes dissent. That consent is not from the beginning in everyone in one society, and the opposed opinions come from contradiction, which are opposed interests within the same society. And there is way in my paper to understand the dynamic of contradiction, the opposed view on the same system, and the impossibility sometimes to abolish a relation of domination, like the slaves. They did not abolish, I think, the relation of slavery. And the change from slavery to something else did not come from a revolution of slaves. But we have to explain all these things. But so the second part of his paper, I do agree with what we say, because it's what I say, in fact. So there is no difference between Maurice Bloch and me. He is not going to say, I think that there are contradictions and they move the society. I do think also the same, and I have said the same. So I don't want you to think that he has summarized my paper and criticized my paper. He has not summarized, he did not criticize my paper. He said the same differently. But on this point I am very clear. I can argue with you.
Would you want a couple of minutes to reply to that, or would
I'll
you
just say one
have to wait?
What I'm saying is that we need to have some way of saying that some statements are non-ideological and that some statements are ideological, and not believe that they're always intricately put together. And I think it is not what I have said. I said it is impossible, in fact, No, that's right. I'm just saying we're not saying the same thing. So that's the only point that I'm just trying to make.
It is not impenetrable ideology. I didn't never say that. It's not a sort of impenetrable reality.
At this
It's
point, I
completely
must
different.
declare the discussion generally open. Ernest Gellner.
There was a pervasive theme in Maurice Godelier's paper, which was terribly clearly presented, and which would take us a very long time to discuss because it's very, very fundamental. I mean, one could ask, is his particular form of revisionism acceptable? Does it avoid the danger of being too accommodating and under its clarity and elegance? But I think that this will take us a long time, and I don't want to open that discussion. But I can see that this is the centre of his endeavour. What intrigued me was a much more specific point buried in this paper, which I don't know whether other people set up at that point because it's enormously provocative. I speak with trepidation because it concerns a topic of which other people here have done very distinguished work, whereas to me something I impressionistically think about rather than incompetent to speak. Well, it's enormously exciting, enormously provocative, and I mean both provocative and exciting, and I just want to spell it out to see how people reacted to it or whether they missed it because it was so abstractly formulated. And this was a fascinating remark about the relationship of kinship to congealed labour. Now it has a great a priori plausibility, the argument that the less congealed labour, the more kinship matters, because the less congealed labour, the more people matter, and kinship, of course I'm very sympathetic to that, kinship not just an idiom, kinship has something to do with the reproduction of people. That's a tangential issue which I don't want to reopen. It has a plausibility, and in fact it seems to me to fit the recent transition from pre-industrial to developed industrial societies, where not so much the fantastic quantity of congealed labour that's around us, but the particular form it has, makes it very difficult to use kinship consistently for the allocation of social roles. Now, it seems to be the sociology of modern egalitarianism that is very awkward in a complex industrial society to use the hereditary principle for most social posts. It seems to me to fit in that case, but for the past, the point at which he meant to apply it was in fact the transition from primitive society to society with great amount of capital, great amount of congealed labour. And there, in my impressionistic way, I know it worked in this systematically, I thought the correlation was exactly the inverse. That precisely where congealed labour is very unimportant, consequently people, instead of using kinship for allocating themselves to groups, are rather opportunist and form alliances. Whereas the moment you get more property, kinship become, I don't know, everybody knows the theory, but I just, given the fact that he made such a provocative remark about it, I just would be very curious to hear how the experts in this field feel about it.
Can I just say one thing? I think there's a problem of using the Australian Aborigines as an example for hunters and gatherers, and this is something I meant to touch on.
They're highly aberrant.
Right.
I mean, in general, hunters and gatherers have no kinship system. Right. I mean, the general pattern of the Hadza, for example, have virtually no kinship. But again and again, not only that, but all the cognatic systems of Southeast Asia. I mean, I've just had a field worker come back from a peasant group on the borders of Burma and Thailand. And at first he said, you know, all this stuff about kinship, there is no, kinship simply doesn't matter in this society. And I'm sure he's right. And I had the same thing from a Borneo group, because when I went to Borneo, I went out of my way to try and turn the kindred into something meaningful. And later, one of my pupils went back and said, but you're right, kind of wrong. In point of fact, you just made this up. Kinship just doesn't matter in this sort of society. And he's right. The kinship matters in unilineal systems. It just doesn't matter in these cognatic systems.
Can I just add one more thing? I think there's a reason why it matters for the Australian Aborigines, because they don't have congealed labour, but they have congealed women, which is, and that's why they're different.
It is a metaphor. It is not an explanation. It's Washburn's metaphor about congealed women. It's a metaphor. It's not an explanation. They allocate women. They say.
Yeah.
They farm women. No,
I think Ernest's point is very important for the transition from proto-industrial to industrial societies, the one that Maurice made. Then it has something to do with the fact that the plant, the congealed labour, is no longer manufactured within domestic groups, and therefore people become more dependent in that sense on systems of the creation of this congealed labour is shifted outside the domestic group. And this is one very simple minded aspect of its relationship to.
The main fact seems to me that, first of all, it's innovation has become part of the culture, instability is part of the normality. Consequently, you get constant allocation of constant creation of new posts, elimination of old ones, and a good proportion, I don't know how many, a good proportion of them are talent specific.
Yeah.
And in those conditions, heredity becomes terribly awkward. And that seems to be the main, I mean, I've listed, whilst I'm thinking about it, a number of other factors, but this seems to be the main one for why this relationship between congealed labour and the importance of kinship does hold for our recent transition, but I tend to be on the other side.
Can I discuss an aspect of Maurice's later discussion of political domination?
Maurice or Maurice?
Which
one?
It's both the same.
Godelier is it's both the same, yes. Of Gody's discussion in that final section of his about legitimacy. Because I think you take, whereas I agree with the general thesis about the transfer of the legitimization of dynastic systems by over time, I think you take rather an over, I may say so, functionalist view of the relationship that is involved here. If we may take the Mosi example, for example, it is perfectly true that, as in most of these systems, that the installation ceremonies involve an abasement before the abased groups. But that takes place once at the installation. It may take place on specific ritual aspects of the year, but then for the other 364 days, these people are bending down and throwing dust over themselves as they go before the monarch. So that to describe this in terms of exchange and reciprocity is...
No, you cannot have oppression without a language of reciprocity. No, the same as reciprocity does not prevent the growth of classes. In fact, the Inca, as John Moore says in his book on the Inca economy, the Inca were phrasing their exaction and the corvée system within the language of reciprocity. All time. It was a reciprocal relationship between. So reciprocity is the way to develop class structure. It's not opposed to. It is exactly the way. And wage, salary is a contract between a capitalist and a worker. It's a contract. It's reciprocity.
Well, I just want to say...
It doesn't oppose reciprocity to class.
This reverts to Maurice's point here, that although there is, in a sense, exchange of services, and this is perceived as an exchange of services, it's also perceived, in a sense, as unequal. And that is where the contradiction comes in, and that is... and it is perceived as unequal, and that is why, when the French came down there, these people threw off their lords because they saw an opportunity for overthrowing this particular relationship. And what is more, there wasn't simply, I mean, although it is perfectly true that there was initial domination and then over time a legitimation, one has to remember too that when the French came in, for example, that time, the new chief of Mosi, he was going to have to abase himself before his before these earth priests, was in fact at the borders of the kingdom, raiding for slaves, and this is continuous. This isn't just one, the initial domination and the initial war. He was raiding for slaves on the boundaries against precisely the same kind of people as he was abasing himself to in the initial situation. In other words, it was a continuous process of domination, not within, but of very similar people. of people connected with the earth outside. And to some extent, this was if you like, there was aspects of purification about this whole process there. But certainly the people who were within the system, I mean, recognized that that these people were continually dominating by force, and it wasn't that force was given up, force was added to by legitimacy, but they were still there with force.
Again,
Yeah.
there's something difficult.
Yeah.
I have never opposed violence to consent. I mean, violence never stops to be there, at least as a possible potential threat. Never stops.
Yeah.
You cannot oppose violence too. I mean, consent prevents some form of affront, I would say, affront,
Yes,
you know, and maintains the contradiction between dominated and dominant peoples within limitations which to reproduce the relationship of oppression and domination. I mean, consent does do something, is to maintain, and when the consent is becoming decent, violence is moving from a potential threat to something actual, really. I have never opposed or thought of a word without violence. Violence does not mean that consent does not exist, and consent does not mean that violence does not exist. What I want to say is just a point. If you take the case of what you call reciprocity, when you take the case of the Inca, the great Inca, in fact, the strength of the power is violence and plus consent. The people do think that the Inca does control the condition of reproduction, of fertility of women of the fields and so on. And more imaginary are the powers of the Inca, more trivial is what the people bring to the Inca. Because what the people bring is what everybody knows, how to dig the ground, to carry stones on their shoulders. And in fact, you never pay back the Inca for what he does for you. And the extreme of ideology is when the dominated people appear to be victims of the domination they exert. In fact, to be the most victim, in fact, more than the people dominated, because they have to carry on with all the prohibitions. And you know, in Africa, all the prohibition a king is you know, performing. In fact, he cannot move, cannot drink, he cannot. And it is, in fact, I think the extreme of ideological process is when the dominated do appear as being victim of their own domination, the most to support from the domination. And I think it is really like that it works, ideology. The extreme of ideology is that. So I don't oppose reciprocity does not prevent the growth of classes. And if you can get a sort of exchange, and it must be an exchange of services, and more imaginary are the services, the less you can pay to the people who bring you life. To me, for instance, I think the concept of debt, and I remember Leach in his book on political islands, systems of island Burma, you say that the concept of debt, not of money debt, but to be indebted to somebody or a group to another group, this concept was crossing all the society from bottom to top. And it was the leading concept to understand the dynamic of the system, debt between groups and debt between peoples. And to me, the condition of growth of domination is something which must take the form of a debt between groups and a debt between. So it is my way of thinking about the growth of inequalities, you know. The concept of debt without any monetary value or idea, but debt.
Ernest, Gellner, then Arnaldo, Momiliagno.
Just to say, I don't know whether I heard Jack suggesting that the Mosque was unusual or unique about the legitimation of sorry. Well, I'm just going to add anecdotally. I mean, in the Atlas, the conquerors, the semi-nomadic or transhuman conquerors who came in from the south and took land by violence, having won, then legitimated it with the consent of the people from whom they took it, by making a sacrifice to the people from whom they took it, thereby putting a shame compulsion on them to get the land. So in terms of the local culture, they could have done that to begin with and saved themselves some fighting, but of course presumably it worked. But what is interesting about this is a society where there's no centralized state. Nevertheless, this, in other words, so that one can't explain people's concern with legitimating things legally by the arrière-pensée that it'd be useful if they come to court. Nevertheless, they're entirely with Maurice Godelier. There's extraordinary interpenetration of both violence and legitimation. And I was always struck there by the fact that despite the anarchic conditions, this dreadful concern was covering yourself. So you use both violence and legitimation, although there are no courts to appeal to. But that's just an anecdotal addition to.
I simply wanted to make a point that the consent did not iron out, did not smooth out contradiction, did not smooth out dissent at the same time there, because otherwise one could not explain change.
It is written. Without that, no change, no history.
Arnaldo.
Well, I mean, I was extremely interested in what Godelier said about the ideology as a form of getting, or the form of getting consent from the exploited. Now, the difficulty which I feel here may be just exemplified by your particular example of the Roman slave. That is, that there, first of all, it seems to me that the facts are wrong about the way in which the slave is represented by the master. That is, it seems to me that, and I think it's generally agreed, I mean, the reason why you call the slave in Rome poor is simply to indicate to him that he never grew up, and that is the main point. As for the question of the emancipatio, I mean, that is, the liberation of the slave in relation to the liberation of the son, this is a different matter, because I mean, the emancipatio of the son happens only under certain circumstances in order to free him from the patria potestas, which is a completely different thing. That is, there is a transference of a form to another, so we leave it. But the main point really is not the question what is the point of calling a slave a poor, but have we any idea or any representation of what is the reaction of the slave to be called like that? I mean, as far as I know, I mean, we have simply no evidence whatsoever of what the slaves, how the slaves reacted to their position in Rome. And that is the point about this very interesting interpretation of yours of the ideology in, as I said, as a way, or the way of getting consent from the exploited. That in the societies in which I happen to have more familiarity, either we have no reaction to that is simply we do not know, or in some cases in which we know the reaction is far more complex than that. I mean, take I don't know whether you can call the Christian the exploiters of the Jews during the Middle Ages or something like that, but I mean, something like that did happen. That is, you have an ideology of the Christians about guilt of the Jews to be as a justification of the way in which you treat the Jews, and in my opinion, you exploit them. But in this particular case, we are privileged because we do know the reaction of the Jews. That is, I mean, they are really an extremely vocal, extremely capable of expressing themselves, and I mean, it is not only it is completely different, but it's also irrelevant. That is there, I mean, there's not, nobody discusses the ideology of the others. It's simply something which is literally not accepted. I mean, I don't want to say not registered, because obviously they knew it. But to that, another ideology is opposed, which, you know, takes position against the others, but in an extremely different form. And that is what, you know, is my difficulty about your, there is that, though I would very much like to believe that an ideology is so, in a simple way, the way of getting some sort of acceptance of the position of an inferior. by the inferior himself, I have these two difficulties. A, that in those societies in which I happen to know, either you have no evidence whatsoever what the other people feel, or if you have the knowledge of what they feel, I mean, then the mere fact that these people are capable or in the position of verbalizing their own reaction is already an indication that the thing goes not so simply like that. That is, that you have the constitution of another ideology which is not a direct answer to the ideology of the master class.
Raphael.
I was thinking about ways in which what Godelier was saying were helpful to Marxism, perhaps to history. I mean, it seems to me the fundamental bias of the paper is the first part of the paper in particular, seeing ideas as a material reality, and that what the I think what this would the way in which one could use this and should kind of bias it would suggest to historians, and I think it would be very helpful is because it would then make one look at the actual conditions of production of ideas instead of seeing them in some kind of passive way as a reflection of something taking place, as it were, after the event, but as being a part of the event. And particularly thinking about kinship and seeing kinship as organizing a certain, in some social formations, as organizing relations of production. I think it's what it might focus attention on and could be used to focus attention on in early modern and modern European history is something that historians on the whole had very much to say about, and that's looking at petty commodity production, handicraft production, and at peasant economies in which the wife and children act as an unpaid act in place of an absent proletariat, act as unpaid wage labour. And I mean, this is clearly a kind of primary economic relationship without which you can't explain a great deal of production in early modern Europe, indeed in Britain. So I think one could argue sectors of the economy down to the end of the 19th century, and yet it's not thought of as being a part of our economic history at all. On the last part of the paper on domination and consent, I find myself in difficulty in wondering, thinking about ways in which one might use this in history, because, and I think it's a difficulty that Marxist theory of ideology has. I wonder whether it mightn't be more helpful, at least with the kinds of materials with which we have to deal in modern history, to think of consciousness as being the thing which needs to be explained rather than ideology, and that if one was thinking of popular or petit bourgeois or ruling class or any other group consciousness at any time, you need more than the dyad of domination and consent, and above all one would need to not only allow for but actually theoretically point to the contradictory elements that make up consciousness. I mean, you referred to these early in your paper, incidentally, when you talked about, for instance, utopianism. I mean, the elements of popular consciousness at any time will be made up of much more than a simple acceptance or indeed resistance to a ruling class domination. So I don't think that within that axis one could actually construct a theory of popular consciousness anyway with the kind of material with which modern historians work. But I did find the paper extremely helpful.
To Kahn.
Well, I'm not sure if this is not taking it away slightly, but I wanted to ask both Maurice Godelier and Maurice Bloch about how it's really a question of clarification, how they would handle the treatment of commodity fetishism and where it actually lies, because it seems to me that Godelier, disagreeing with the idea of instances, seems to me there's some problem here is how you deal with it with the concept of fetishism, which is both within the relations of production and at the same time is not a reflection of economic relations, but as Marx says, built up on the appearances of those relations. And I think it's significant for Maurice Bloch's paper because it seems to me fetishism for him would not, I guess, be about social structure, but rather would be like on the level of the Bolognese ideas about agriculture, that is, ideas about the economy. And it is neither universal nor non-ideological. And I think that might bring out maybe the differences in approach.
Sally Humphreys.
Well,
Would you hold on and I'll ask both of them to reply to that and then we'll come back to you. Fine. Maurice Bloch.
I would like to say that, I would think of commodity fetishism as like the agricultural rights of the Balinese, and the way they link up, the way they represent on certain occasions agriculture is ultimately a gift of the gods mediated through the various castes. And I wouldn't at all, but one of the things which is extremely interesting in Hobart's work, for example, is it shows that in fact the principles of organisation of Balinese agriculture are of a completely different nature. You've actually got to get the business of actually doing the kinds of things. And it seems to me that similarly, at the height of the capitalist period, as I think, well, as half suggested by Maurice Godelier this morning, the organisation of production was different and was perceived to be different. It had to be perceived to, as it was to a certain extent if it was going to work. And was perceived as exploitative indeed by, I should think, both the working class and indeed the capitalist class. So I would, the answer just very simply is that I would put fetishism on the social structure side in the terms that I was talking about.
But the distinction would be, seems to me, real versus illusory. It's the right to the illusory part of it, and then there's the real part that they really know about.
Yes, I'm a bit unhappy about illusory for much the same reasons Maurice Godelier is that I don't think of illusory as a trick of the priests, but I see it as I see in the illusory part this strange mixture between constraint and consent, like the Jubilee celebrations. But there are other things than the Jubilee celebrations, and there are other things in agricultural rights. There is the day-to-day practice, which requires concepts, like, any activity obviously requires concepts and thoughts. And these seem to be of an entirely different nature, and these seem to be the source of radical thinking, the source of the medieval Jews in thinking of their own position in Professor Momiliagno's points.
Maurice Godelier.
Well, about the fetishism of commodities, for the workers, they know what it is to work for a capitalist. They knew the conditions, they were suffering of these conditions, they had surely consciousness and way of reacting, smashing the machines and so on. They moved from that to trade union and so on. We know, but no worker has produced the theory of value. Fetishism of commodity means that even if you fight against the relation of production, they do appear, the value, the process of creating value and surplus value do appear as a property of things. And for the workers, there was no scientific knowledge of their own social relationships. There was sufferings, fighting back and so on, and development of forms of consciousness. But one thing was missing, was the analysis of profit as unpaid labor, because these people were paid. They were not sacked. They were paid every day, and sometimes on Sunday they were paid sometimes. So no way for them, in their spontaneous consciousness, to build up a theoretical theory, really, of what surplus value is unpaid labor. There is no way for unpaid labor to appear as unpaid labor. Only a theory gives you the explanation. No way to appear as such. And that is fetishism of commodity.
But
first point.
You would say it's within the relations of production.
Sure.
But you would distinguish the fetishism from what's really, you say real, what's really going on. And that sounds to me like
Yes, but no. Between interpreting reality, it is two ways of interpreting. Doesn't mean there are two realities. We are dealing with two forms of consciousness. One is a theoretical one, and another one is another. I am not dealing with two realities, one hidden and the other one existing at the surface. It's very different. It's the way the things appear, but there are no two things. There are one thing, the process of production of value and surplus value. I
but
do
they
agree
are
with
different things, you're saying, aren't you?
I mean, the internal fabric of the process of production of value and surplus value, this internal fabric does not appear in the spontaneous consciousness of the people. You need to take another way to discover that, and that was Marx's way, and he wrote Das Kapital. It takes 25 years to understand the mechanism of that. And, you know, it is what? I don't disagree with what you say about fetishism of community. I have space in my own paper to put that, you know. And the second thing I want to say is about Professor Momiliagno's statement. I have been living 4 years among the Baruya, and the domination of males and females, of men and women, is the basic social inequality. I was the only man to attend 3 times the initiation of the women. And what the women were saying to the women, I was the only man there, for days. Do obey to men. Make love when he wants to make love. Rush and go to fetch some food in the gardens when the friends of your husband are coming. All the rules, there was no such thing as an anti-male ideology. The ideology of the dominant sex were the official ideology of the dominated sex. But I have lived for 4 years, and I can tell you that the women, they have consent, official consent, but they do react. They do not cook. They do not make love. They do go to visit their mother for 3 weeks with the children, and what he does, the man, he does not cook, and so on. They do kill the husband, not officially, but they push the man when they cross the river because they don't know how to swim, the Baruya. So, boom, he disappears. And so I have seen many ways for the women to protest, to react, to contradict, but never to abolish the domination. And we are dealing with abolishment of a social relationship, of a contradiction, not reaction to contradiction, forms of consciousness, individual or collective, form of reaction. And what was the reaction of men to dissent of women? Kill. Brutality. So, I have seen in the actual process of life, dissent, violence, consent, and dissent, and violence, and so on. This process, individual reaction, collective reaction of women, but nowhere abolishment of the domination of males on females. What upsets me with the theory of ideology, which does exist now, is you get the impression that everything from the growth of classes or states have started from sheer brute violence, and ideology is coming after, just to swallow the tablet. You swallow ideology after and you keep quiet for centuries. That is wrong. From the very beginning, violence and consent were the two components of the growth of state and classes and so on, and any kind of domination in some way. It is why I would like to be able to be more intelligent and to be more learned and to deal with religion. Because when a Marxist will bring a good book on religion, it will be all right. But I must say I am not convinced with what I read and what I write.
Could I just sort of answer very briefly? I mean, it seems to me one of the things is that I entirely agree with you that you always have both this consent and violence mixed together. But the problem is it possible to think of violence without thinking of consent? And is it possible to think of consent which is...
Never.
No, that is the difference, you see.
No.
And
You cannot think of one without the other one. It does not exist. One without the other one does not exist. Universal love does not exist. Universal violence does not exist. They are pure abstraction. You can play with that. Does not mean anything. Does not go anywhere. To me.
Sally Humphreys, and I'm afraid that will be the last contribution.
Could I get a question in after Sally? I just wanted to ask a question.
Fine.
To clarify things.
Yeah, I wanted to make 2 points, both of which come out, in fact, of Zimmel's essay on the triad. One is that I think it's there that Zimmel, he quotes from some, sort of manual of household management. If you don't want to have trouble with your maids, only have one. If you have two, they're going to gang up on you. Trouble starts immediately. Anyway, I think on this problem of ideology, and the distinction between ideology and consciousness is very important, because it really seems to me that Maurice Bloch's problem, if the problem is simply, how do people have any kind of opposition idea, then I don't see it as a real problem. Once you have two maids, they're going to have opposition ideas. We do in fact know enough about ancient slaves. Even ancient slave owners knew that slaves, when they were got together, joked and made rebellious remarks and so on. So that it's the problem, it does seem to me, is under what conditions do people produce a whole sort of theory of the way that society works, which is an alternative to the official theory, so to speak, and not just under what conditions do they have moments of consciousness that this is not really the way to be done. But the other point that Zimmel makes in the triad is that the domination is much more complicated than this opposition between consensus and violence, because there are all sorts of cases of dominating people because they were playing off two groups. The Athenian Empire, the Athenians dominated their allies because they knew that within every allied city there were two parties opposed to each other. The one party would support them, provided that they would knock the other. And it seems to me that a great deal of domination can be successfully carried out on that basis, and that to present it as a sort of pure alternative between violence and consent is grossly oversimplifying the question.
Edward Thompson's question.
I just wanted to ask this question to clarify the discussion tomorrow. I'm really asking a question about what ideas are in your presentation. You, at one point, discussed 4 functions of thought.
Yeah.
And the third and the fourth function, to organize relations and to legitimate realities. I really wanted to know whether within ideas you were also including norms and value systems.
Absolutely, yeah.
You are?
Yeah,
and I think this
sure.
problem, problems arise from this.
To legitimize is to attach values to task.
But you are quite confident that you can set up a scheme of explanation in which will take in both formation of ideas and ideologies and
values.
normative
values.
imperatives.
Yeah. Yes.
You see
your
no
question.
need for any analytical...
Oh yes, I see many needs for many analytical steps.
Yeah.
What I have tried to do is to say in 60 pages a few things.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
I apologize, but it is really I need to develop more. But your question is, I do agree with your question. I have to deal with these differences between norms or normative representations, norms of behavior, values, and but the distinction is very difficult, because once you start to legitimate, you organize. When you start to organize, you legitimate. It is why I am not playing with trying to find true ideological ideas and true unideological ideas. Is wrong from the very beginning. Once you legitimate, you organize, and to organize, it's legitimate. It is why it's so difficult. There's no such thing as true ideology. Does not exist. Cannot exist to me. It is why it is so difficult to use distinction, Althusser has one, on infrastructure, superstructure, and ideology. Ideology does not exist as an instance at the top, everywhere, and there is no way to really cut through, to legitimate and to organize.
So when you change your ideology, you change your system of organization.
Absolutely.
So you change your system.
You change your life too.
You change your
change your
system
life.
of plant classification.
Yes, you change your life. You modify your life and others' lives too. You become a, I don't know, you become a Marxist or you become a Christian. It's not a matter of idea only. You change your life. And you change somebody's life too around you. You modify slightly something in society.